I'm always embarrassed by applause, so please desist. Today has indeed been a momentous day. It's been a good day since the very start, because 2, 3, 5, 10 years ago, no university at all in the UK would have held a Climate Change Action Day. So this represents significant progress, and I'm very pleased to say that Lincoln is leading the way. It's been leading the way for some time. It declared its own climate environment emergency last year, and it's been, in the interim period, doing what it can to integrate measures which will ameliorate the damage that we're doing to the climate. So it's a real pleasure to have been here today talking to a mixture of audiences. Normally, for this lecture, I'm here 6 days earlier. We normally do it on Halloween, when we're entertained with more interesting things than myself. In the past, we've had owls, vultures, recalcitrant vultures that have refused to fly, and fascinating bats. But tonight, you'll have to put up with just myself. And my plan is to speak to you for about an hour, and if there's time, we'll do some questions at the end. Great Lives is the title, or the thread that the lectures are run under here. And I suppose the first question, therefore, is, are they? I mean, do we have great lives? I can't answer for any one of you. I know one or two of you slightly, so I can only answer for myself. And I think it will be pretty difficult to argue that I haven't had a degree of a great life, not because of what I do, but because of the time that I've lived. So I was born in 1961, I'm 58 years old. In the UK, I've not needed to live through a war. We've been at peace here. We've had terrorism and other factional divisions, but we've not had to live through a war. There's no danger of me getting a call up and having to go overseas and fight anyone. I've lived through a time of relative affluence, so I've never been hungry, I've never been cold, I've never been thirsty. I've also lived through a time when our society has been structured that I've been able to have a good quality, free education. I went to state schools, I got a grant to go to university, those were the days. But I think that the quality of education that I had in my large, comprehensive sixth form and university was really good, and it stood me in good stead to understand the things that I've wanted and needed to. I've also had access to free healthcare, and on that count, I'm still here talking to you, because at least on 2 occasions, the National Health Service have undoubtedly saved my life. I am fortunate to live in a country where I am not exposed to extremes of weather, which are going to damage my outlook and my life and my ability to live my life. A country which still has enough to interest me as a naturalist. So I can't really complain that I haven't had a great life. But if you contrast that life to the life that has been led by other people since 1961 when I was born, then I've had a remarkable life, and we've all had remarkable lives if we've been living in the UK for that period of time in one way or another, outside of our personal ups and downs. You know, you think of the famines that were occurring in the 1960s. One of my most poignant memories when it comes to engaging with television was watching the Biafran famine at the end of the 1960s, which was the first big famine, I imagine, that was televised. And I hold very profound memories of looking at starving children. And as a child at that time, that was very poignant. You know, it was difficult to conceptualize another part of the world, which my father showed me in an atlas, so I knew where Biafra was, where there were children of my age dying of starvation. We've lived through the nuclear weapons age. Again, that cast a cloud over my early life. I remember going to bed in the 1960s, having seen, you know, the duck and cover films, not knowing whether I would wake up in the morning. You know, I was obsessed with drawing mushroom crowds on my school exercise books, and that generated an enormous amount of anxiety. I think more than anything, aside from the fact that, you know, there was never an assurity, in my mind at least, that I would wake up and live another day, the thing that resonated more than anything was that whether that happened or not was beyond my control. It was going to be someone in a distant part of the world who I didn't know, whose language I didn't understand, who might press a button and I would cease to exist along with a lot of other human beings, and the planet would entertain a grotesque catastrophe. And that disempowerment, that not having control of whether I was going to wake up the next day, left a long-standing scar. And I think it must have done for an enormous number of young people who were in that position. Then we moved into the 70s and 80s, and there was a downscaling of the nuclear weapons issue, but it hasn't gone away. The nuclear weapons still exist. They're still out there. And at the moment, our relationship with Russia is not the best it's ever been. But the interesting thing is that I've now reached 58 years old, and I face a different threat, which is causing me anxiety. It's not a new threat to me. It's a threat that I've been aware of for at least the last 30 years. But it's been brought to a head and to public attention. And now it's something that I can share with you. The concerns that I've long held for the climate, biodiversity, population growth, the health of this planet, were previously only things that I could talk about in nature reserve car parks, the backs of cars, and university lecture theatres. But now we live in an age where we are all, as a community, aware of the very grave threat of climate change. And the difference between that and the nuclear threat, the nuclear cloud that we lived under in the 60s and 70s and 80s, or those that are older, the 50s as well, of course, is one that was unpredictable and was going to be precipitated by political events. The difference with the climate is that it's happening. It's already beyond our control in some ways. It's going to happen. It's going to get worse. The impacts that we are seeing are going to get worse. And as a consequence of that, it's more terrifying. It's not an if, it's an actual. So I thought I'd start by showing you a short film which I contributed to just the week before last. It was made by Richard Curtis. Richard Curtis has made films that I haven't seen. Notting Hill. Love Actually I have seen, I have to say. But my various partners have watched all of those films with great interest, as I've been watching Apocalypse Now and any number of zombie films. But anyway, Richard Curtis is an acclaimed filmmaker, and it was made in the studio of Rankin, an acclaimed photographer, and it was made by them on behalf of Extinction Rebellion. Let's take a look at the film now. It's only short, it's just a minute.
Our planet is in crisis. You know it, we know it. But honestly, where is our emergency plan?
It's not good enough.
We demand our government protects our future generations.
We demand they stop all destruction
of our forests, our oceans, and our wildlife.
No argument.
Oh, you want to know what XR demand? Here's what we demand.
We demand that we are involved in the decision making. It's our futures too.
We demand our governments reduce global carbon emissions to zero within 10 years.
Yeah, 10 years.
We demand they end any support for the fossil fuel economy and invest
in a green economy.
We demand clean rivers,
fresh air, healthy soils.
We need to work with nature
to sort out all that damage.
We demand the will and action of our government.
We demand a fair and just plan that addresses global inequality,
so that everyone, north and south, can adapt to the new world which we must live in.
We demand training for the young and retraining for the old to help us all make a new start.
We have a simple choice to make. Either our governments make hard decisions now, or we all face tragic consequences later.
Where is your plan?
Where is your plan?
Where's your plan?
Where's your plan?
Where is your plan?
Where's your plan?
Where is your plan?
Where is your plan? We only have my lifetime left. Where is your plan?
It's quite pertinent and poignant that the film was top and tailed by the youngest person that featured. Because I, and many of you present here tonight, have on our consciences the fact that we failed that generation and other younger generations. Failed to the extent that we've known for some time of the grave problems that we've faced, and we've neglected to do anything about it. If you've read the State of Nature report, the third of which was published just a couple of weeks ago, and you have a keen interest in the UK's environment and its natural history, you'll know, and I won't mince words, that our environments and guilds of those species are going to hell in a handcart. And this is the third report that's been published. And the news in each of them has not got better, it's got worse. Now, I've been a proactive conservationist since I left university. I've been a keen naturalist all of my life. So let's just think about what's been going on whilst I'm meant to have been helping things. Well, since 1970, we've lost between 40 and 50% of all the world's wildlife. So that's since the time I got my first pair of binoculars. So since I've been looking at it and fascinated by it, 50% of it globally has gone. Since the same period, 1970, we've lost 90 million birds from the UK countryside. 90 million birds. I struggle to envisage what 90 million birds looks like. I saw 3 million birds once. They were big pink ones, flamingos, in Africa's Rift Valley. I didn't know what to do for the next 3 or 4 days. It was a bit like a moon landing. You know, I often wondered what Neil did when he got back. He certainly couldn't have had a pizza and watched a video, could he? It's difficult to follow that. And I wandered around in a daze after seeing 3 million pink flamingos. I'd much rather have seen any number of the 90 million that have disappeared from our countryside. But 90 million, one of the problems that we face is that people like myself are armed with an enormous array of statistics when it comes to decline, increases, changes in distribution and population. But making them tangible, even to ourselves, is really, really difficult. So that's just 2 instances how I think we failed. And those relate to wildlife. But what about the bigger picture, the environment, that climate? As I've intimated earlier, there are plenty of people in this room who've known exactly what's been going on for a long period of time. But we haven't managed to get any of our decision makers to make significant enough moves to address any of it. And now we find ourselves with a climate crisis, a climate and environment emergency. The IPCC, the Intergovernmental Panel for Climate Change, last year gave us 12 years to sort it out, beyond which their mathematical models, which they've come up with, cannot predict what will happen. And this is not untypical of any models that we see within science. They will work to a set of rules within a given set of parameters, but when you can't plug the parameters in, the rules might drastically change and the results could be unpredictable. Now, the predictable results are terrifying enough. The thought that they might be unpredictable goes beyond that. And 12 years, that's the timescale that they've currently suggested. Science updates itself. What's science fact today could be fiction tomorrow. That's what we like about science. Science is ongoing. It's an ongoing curiosity to find the contemporary truth. But 12 years is nothing. Everyone in this room can remember what they were doing with clarity, I imagine, 12 years ago. It's just yesterday. We don't have much time to sort things out. And that's why I think that, we have the audacity to demand things. The video that you've just seen isn't any longer asking our decision makers to change things. It's demanding that they change things. And the word demand is a clear change in vernacular. We're not any longer tiptoeing around as we have done in the past, timidly on the outside, tapping on the door. Oh, excuse me, hello, I think we've got a bit of a problem out here. It's all heating up. There's a drought, people are starving. It's going to get worse. They didn't listen. And if they did listen, they ignored it. So now we have no choice but to strike some pretty demonstrative demands. Now, this is the Extinction Rebellion handbook. This is not a drill. It was published earlier this year, and I'm pleased to say it's already out of date. That won't please Penguin, because they've probably still got quite a lot of them on the shelf. But it will please myself and the rest of Extinction Rebellion, because the movement has moved on, and therefore some of the things in here are out of date. But I would still suggest that it's worth £7.99, because the underlying principles of what they're trying to achieve are clearly outlined, and if there was any ambiguity about that, then you can read them. But on this page there's a quote, and it says, "Power concedes nothing without a demand. It never did and it never will. Power concedes nothing without a demand. It never did and it never will." I think there's the potential for real truth in that, because ultimately we have been asking and we have been ignored. And as a consequence of that, the time is to stop asking and start demanding. Now, I'm standing here with my Extinction Rebellion badge on, and I've been championing that movement all day. I'm a keen supporter of that movement as it stands at this point in time, but like so many other things in my life, I reserve the right to change my mind. As long as the movement continues with its non-violent direct action, then it can count upon my support, because that type of demonstration has a proven recent human history of success. Cast your mind back, those of you who are old enough, to the 1960s, which I can remember, and the human rights movement that was very proactive in North America, addressing issues of racial inequality, economic inequality, so on and so forth. The Vietnam War tied in at the end of that as well. And this brought those issues to global attention, significantly enough in my own life, watching Panorama, seeing what happened at Kent State University, that by the mid-70s, when I got to my mid-teens, I took part in a Rock Against Racism event in London. And that was a load of punk bands, which I greatly enjoyed, playing on stage, but an enormous number of people, far more than that were expected at the time, turning up because they'd realised that racism was basically wrong, and we didn't want to tolerate it. We'd seen it in aspects of our lives. It was frequent on television. All forms of media were outrageously racism. It was endemic in all sorts of organisations, including the police, including the BBC, which broadcasts some terrible things with the benefit of hindsight. But we put that behind us, and the whole point was moving forwards. It's interesting that the atmosphere of Rock Against Racism 1978 was very similar to that I experienced when I attend the current Extinction Rebellion demonstrations. But going back to the method, the non-violent direct action, you can go back to the middle of the last century and what Gandhi was trying to do. I'm not comparing Extinction Rebellion with the Salt March and everything else, but the methodology underlying it was the same. And then back to the beginning of that century, when the suffragists, the women, were asking for votes, and largely the action that they took was non-violent. And some of the things that they did, which were mildly violent, were pretty similar to the things that Extinction Rebellion have done to date. The point is, I think, that we don't need violence to win an argument in this instance, because we have the foundation of scientific truth on our sides. Which brings me back to those harbingers of doom, the IPCC. Now, the IPCC, amongst many others, are scientists who we've entrusted to independently and impartially assess the data, to record, collect, assess, and publish the data. And they've done a brilliant job, as scientists do, as people here at the University of Lincoln do. That's one of the greatest human achievements, isn't it? Exercising our curiosity, that desire to know and learn, to acquire knowledge, and then to have it peer-reviewed and published so it can be judged to be truthful and trustworthy. Now, what should happen is that that information should be then given to our decision makers as the basis of making best-informed decisions. We should be listening to these people. These are the people with their finger on the pulse. They are qualified, highly motivated, independent and impartial observers, cataloguers, publishers of truth. But what do we see that's been happening? Well, again, a couple of years ago, maybe 3 years ago now, a scientific paper was peer-reviewed and published in the UK, which showed that under the previous two governments, irrespective of party politics, 80% of scientific advice given to UK government was roundly ignored. Just cast aside and political decisions were made. Maybe those political decisions were made in good faith. Maybe they were made by good public servants, believing that they were doing good public service. Maybe they weren't. Maybe on occasion there were vested interests at stake. Maybe there was corruption at stake. Who knows? But whatever, frankly, I don't care. The fact that we're ignoring 80% of all scientific advice given to our government is dangerous, and that's why we find ourselves in this mess. That's where we find ourselves with diminishing biodiversity in the UK landscape. That's where we find ourselves with a much broader global climate crisis. We've got to start listening to the people who know and tell the truth. And invariably, there are scientists, and that's the people that Extinction Rebellion draw their information from. And yesterday I was on a panel, the Daily Mirror are producing an edition, again, rather like today, a bold step from the University of Lincoln, a line in the sand that's been drawn in a very positive way. The Daily Mirror are publishing a single edition prospectively next Thursday, although you know what newspapers are like, it might change, as a climate change issue. And I was chairing a panel of young and old and qualified yesterday, including scientists from Extinction Rebellion and others. And again, I found myself leaving that in a highly optimistic fashion. So, we've got demands, okay? We've raised our voice, we've raised public awareness. Whether you support Extinction Rebellion or agree with their methods, you've got to agree with the fact that since April, when they really got started, this whole issue has risen up the agenda. It will be, we've yet to see how much, but it will be part of our forthcoming election campaign, because our government declared in the wake of those protests in April a climate and environment emergency, and so did that in Scotland and Wales too. They've got yet to do something meaningful, but that's fine, we're on the case, hence the demonstrations are continuing. The thing is, another quote from this book here, you never change things by fighting the existing reality. To change something, you have to build a new model that makes the existing model obsolete. I'll read it again. You never change things by fighting the existing reality. To change something, you have to build a new model that makes the existing model obsolete. Now, for me in that quote, the key word is build. Because build implies imagination, inventiveness, and creation. It's about making something. It's about coming, in this case, up with something new. So it's not about anarchy. It's not about saying this system, this response to this existential crisis is flawed, therefore we're going to tear it up, smash it up, and start again. It's about coming up with a new model which, through choice and obvious efficacy, will be more suitable than the model that we've got. And I think that that's where movements like Extinction Rebellion need to go next. Because at the moment, they've done a great job of getting a lot of people, not just here in the UK, Extinction Rebellion are now active in more than 100 countries globally, some with more activists, some with less. But nevertheless, in the space of just a year, they celebrated their anniversary in October. They've gone from being a small number of people outside Parliament to a global movement, an extraordinarily rapid growth. And in all of those countries, they've put this issue in the public mind space so that we can think about it and think about how we might address it, both collectively and as individuals. So I think that's great success, particularly in some of those countries where the democracy is not as tolerant of that sort of demonstration as it is in our country. But they do have to now move on. All of these movements have to move on because they have to offer a realistic solution to the problem. What we've said at the moment is that we are a problem. We've made a problem. We're riven with guilt. It's our fault, particularly people like myself who haven't done anything about it. That is demoralising and disempowering. The next step has to be to build that model, which will give us not necessarily hope, but the personal means of empowering ourselves to make a difference, to move towards that hope. So, how do we do that? How do we do that? Well, I think that there are many ways that we can do that. And we need to do it on two levels. We need to do it on a personal level, because that's motivating, it's empowering, it's reassuring. So earlier today, a young man asked in one of the sessions that we had, which type of tree should he plant in his garden to encourage the most wildlife and to address the climate. And I just happened to have a birch tree in the back of my car. Obviously I've always driving around with a little pot of birch trees, and I was very fortunate to be able to give him one of those birch trees. Now, one young man in Lincoln planting a birch tree in his back garden is not going to save the world. And although the tree is a remarkable piece of natural technology, which does lock up carbon, so therefore deals with some of our carbon emissions, which does, in urban situations, dramatically reduce pollution, which does, help ameliorate the effects of flooding, which does nurture nature and make our environment more resilient, the tree is a remarkable organism, a great tool, a great piece of natural technology which we can use. Even if we were to plant 1.9 billion trees in the UK, that's how many we'd have to plant to bring us up to the same number of trees as we've got in most other Western European countries. Even if we had the capacity or the space to do that, we wouldn't be addressing the dangerous effects of climate change. So what's the point? What's the point, you could argue, of one small, ambitious boy planting a tree? Well, the clear point is that it's going to make him feel like he's done something. It's going to make his concern and his effort meaningful. And ultimately, as an organism, as a species, that we need that. We need to feel good about ourselves and our endeavours and our objectives. We have a conscience, and at the moment that conscience is pretty tortured. So we have to make sure that we have the power to do those things. They may be symbolic, but we like symbolism, don't we? We like it when we draw a line in the sand and we don't cross it. We like it, ultimately, when we find the courage to change our minds. But the trouble with the human species, from my observation, is that we're not very good at changing our minds. We seem to assemble a mindset of ideas at a certain point, maybe in that time of our youth, when we're particularly absorptive to all of those things. And we make up our mind about which art we like, which music we like, which films we like, which carpet we like, which dogs we like, poodles. And then we don't move on. I've got 2 new dogs. Guess what they are? They're not Labradors, because I'm not changing my mind. For me, the poodle is the best dog in the world. I like other dogs a bit, but I can never like them as much as I like poodles. So I've stuck with poodles. I've got the choice of an enormous range of breeds. I could have gone for a breed that I know nothing about. It could have been challenging, would have been interesting, but no, I've gone because I'm led by my heart, and perhaps not my head, because I'm not getting any sleep, and I've gone for poodles. And that's what we're like. For us to change our minds takes an enormous amount of personal energy, an enormous amount of sometimes personal angst, anxiety. And yet at this point in time, I feel that there's an underlying need, an underlying urge for us to confront those personal choices. And I feel that very definitely. So in the last 2 years, I've changed more things in terms of my lifestyle than I've changed ever before. And I've systematically gone through, consciously analysed, given the best information I've got at the time, and where I can, I've changed my mind, changed my practice. Now, I'm not perfect, and I've not reached the point where I've done everything that I could, but I'm working my way through that list as much as I have time and space, money, the opportunity to, access to do those things. And every time I achieve one, I feel slightly less guilty. I'm never going to solve the problem, but at least on my deathbed, if it's a slow death, I'll be able to think to myself, well, when you were confronted with a choice between not so good and better, you chose the better one. We like that as individuals. So making those individual choices, doing those little things in your home, in your life, which in the grand scheme of things are undeniably inconsequential, is really important. Except that if we all do them, then they actually can become quite meaningful. So collectively, if we exercise that ability to change our minds and we continue to make that progress, then we can make a difference collectively on some of the issues. The trouble is, we're quite intolerant as well. It's another vice of the human species. So, as an example of that, after years of being veggie, last Christmas I decided that I would give veganism a go. I thought I'd try it, I'd explore it, see what it was like in the south of England to be a vegan, what the food was like, what it was like in terms of ease, cost, access, the time it takes to prepare the food, where I'd find it, all of those things. I actually sort of relished the challenge of all of that. So it was a novelty to me. And I've stuck with it. I'm still vegan to this day. But when I started to go through a process, I joined a campaign. I joined the campaign whereby, rather than say demonstratively, I think this is the answer, I think you should all become vegan too, I took a different approach. And that was, I'm going to explore this to see if it's a good idea for me. And in order to explore it, therefore, I had to look at the pros and the cons. Well, that didn't go down too well, because a vocal part of the vegan community were not too keen on me giving any publicity to the cons, because they had quite a didactic ideal, and that is that you should instantaneously switch overnight. You should cross a line, that there was only black and white, and you were either on board or you weren't on board. And if you continued to wear your leather shoes, and you didn't incinerate that beautiful biker's jacket that you bought way back in 1977 and wore to all your Clash gigs that I'm going to be buried in, then you weren't fully embracing the movement. And furthermore, when I visited some low impact, low intensity, organic farms where the quality of the animal's life was much better than the factory farms where you're probably buying food from in supermarkets. When I spoke to farmers who pointed out accurately that the way that they farm with their organic mixed farming regimes actually enhanced biodiversity to a level that it was better than the nature reserve beyond the fence, it didn't go down too well. And this is disappointing, which is why I'm not telling you to become vegan, and I wouldn't. All I'm doing in that campaign, or I was doing in that campaign, is asking people to think about it. It may not work for you. It wouldn't work if you were a sub-Saharan African child. They can't do without meat and dairy. They would starve. They wouldn't get the nutrients, the vitamins, the minerals that they require. So I have an option. I can do it. I have the capacity to choose my food, afford my food, access that food, prepare that food, and take supplements, which I do, which they couldn't possibly do. Furthermore, if everyone in the UK suddenly went, do you know what? Vegan, Wednesday morning, catastrophe. Think of the impact on UK farming. Think of what would happen to our landscape, the collapse in land value. What would happen in terms of land abandonment? In terms of our environment, and certainly biodiversity, it'd be catastrophic. What we have to do is we have to work towards a change. And I think that could happen if we entertain tolerance, because we're not all going to change our mind at the same time. There may be some people out here thinking, I'm never going to be vegan. I eat meat 7 days a week. I really enjoy my meat, But my point would be, why don't you just think about eating it 6 days a week? And then if you get on with that and you find that you can actually find some plant-based food, which is really enjoyable, and I can tell you without getting on a preachy horse that there's lots of very tasty vegetarian or vegan food out there, you might cut down to 5. And then when you cut down to 5, you might think to yourself, do you know what, rather than buy that meat in the supermarket, which I don't know where it came from, and could have been produced in horrible factory farms where animals live under appalling conditions, and it's extraordinarily, destructive to the environment, I might actually use that extra bit of money that I'm not spending on meat to go down my farm shop and buy some good quality, locally sourced organic meat, which I know is being well produced, good animal husbandry, and also good for biodiversity. And you might just think, okay, well that is expensive. We all know the farm shops are more expensive than the supermarkets. So it may be that you have to cut down to 3 days in order to afford to do that. It's progress. I'm still going to shake your hand. I'm just going to still say thank you. I'm not an ultra-vegan. You don't have to cross the line. I just think all we have to do is be tolerant of the fact that we're all going to change our minds at a different pace. It's not a big ask, is it? Well, apparently it is a big ask. It's a massive ask, because when the young members of the royal family are flying around the world and then they're talking about the environment, some members of the tabloid press are jumping all over them and calling them hypocrites. They're saying, hold on a minute, you can't rock up in Pakistan and start talking about, deforestation. You've just arrived here on a private jet. Well, hold on. What would you rather? Would you rather that these highly influential people, our royal family, ignore the environment, or would you rather be tolerant of the fact that they, just like all of us, are going through a learning process where they're becoming aware of the need to address the environment, they're using their position to talk about it and raise that issue, and maybe, and probably, behind the scenes, they're thinking, oh, hold on a minute, this doesn't quite tally with us and the private jet. I don't think it helps to point the finger. It alienates people. It turns them off rather than on. I think we have to exercise that patience and tolerance. Too much. We need the change to be rapid. But I don't think that pointing out people's inadequacies when they're trying to move in the right direction is the way forward. I think we've got to be tolerant of that. There are more issues when it comes to what we can all do. And I've just finished making a programme for the BBC about global population growth, human population growth. And it was motivated because I bought this book years ago, and this is called 10 Billion. It's written by an academic at Cambridge, Stephen Emmett. And I was going to read you a couple of bits out of this book. So basically, this ties in. I'm not going to drift off and start talking about population per se, but there's just one connection that I wanted to make here. So what Stephen has written in this poignant and quite terrifying book is, there are now more than 7 billion of us on Earth. As our numbers continue to grow, we continue to increase our need for more water, far more food, far more land, far more transport, and far more energy. As a result, we are now accelerating the rate at which we're changing our climate. In fact, our activities are not only completely interconnected with, but are now interacting with the complex system we live on Earth. It's important to understand how all of this is connected. Here we go. An increasing population accelerates the demand for more water and more food. We've got to drink, we've got to eat. Demand for more food increases the need for more land, which accelerates deforestation. We know that the amount of useful agricultural land which can produce human food on the planet, is not increasing, it's diminishing. All of these accelerate the demand, increasing demand for food also increases food production and transportation. And all of these accelerate the demand for more energy. This then accelerates greenhouse gas emissions, principally CO2 and methane, which further accelerate climate change. And as climate change accelerates, it increases stress on water, food and land, and at the same time an increasing population also accelerates stress on water, food and land. In short, as population increases and economies grow, stress on the entire system accelerates sharply. So what we're looking at when it comes to the climate is not just us producing climate harming gases, CO2 and methane, etc. It's about our consumption. It's about the fact that we are consuming more stuff. Some of that stuff is food and water. Some of that stuff is this. And today I've been using this as a symbol of our consumption, our mobile phones. And I've chosen the mobile phone because in the UK, we update our mobile phones about every 18 months. Now, this is my iPhone here, I've had it longer than 18 months. And I paid, I think, about £600 for it. And I buy a SIM and just use it that way. But this didn't cost £600. That's what came out of my bank. It didn't cost £600. When you look into the cost of just a mobile phone, what you'll find is that the precious metals that are in here and some of the minerals that are extracted to produce the components of the mobile phone are taken out of the ground in parts of West Africa and the Far East in the most appalling conditions. Slavery, sexual slavery. I saw a report recently which showed that some of the mining camps have basically legions of sex slaves, women dragged into prostitution to service the miners who are being paid next to nothing with no health and safety just to get the stuff to make your phone. Furthermore, the processes of extraction are unregulated, and they're not only causing the initial deforestation but enormous pollution through the runoff of the toxic byproducts of the mining process. So you can't, and more. Which means we can't really put a price on this. You can say it costs £600 in duty-free or something, but you can't say how much this costs the environment. And yet we are conditioned that every 18 months we get another one of these things, that we upgrade. Because our mindset has been changed to that, isn't it? We are an upgrade culture. We don't repair anymore, we replace. I remember when we were kids, if anything broke in the house, there'd be someone somewhere to fix it. Normally my dad. My dad taught me how to fix cars. And certainly for the first 10, 15 years of driving, and some of the old bangers that I've still got, I can go out with something called a Haynes manual, right? And I can take all the skin off my knuckles, and I can do a hell of a lot of swearing in the garage. But I can actually fix a car, so long as it's old. I can't fix a modern car. I can't go near it. It's beyond fixing. It's gone beyond the idea that I'm going to fix it, or pretty much anyone, because it's geared up to be replaced. At least it's being replaced in unit form if something goes wrong with it. This isn't in unit form. This is replaced wholesale. You just swap one for another. The other thing is that we seem to have developed this aspiration for more stuff, in the sense that, ultimately we measure the quality of our lives, perhaps, in a very cynical way, the success of our lives by the amount of stuff that we get. You earn more money, you get a bigger house, which consumes more energy. You get a bigger car, which might consume more fuel. If you don't get a bigger car, you change your car because it's fashionable to do so. And it's not just fast fashion, clothes, but fashion in our life is about upgrading. And we see that as a means of us personally improving. But as I said to people earlier, when it comes to actually making me happy, this phone doesn't make me happy. This is a curse. This is a liability. I'm going to turn it on when I leave here, and there's going to be another 15, 20 emails. I would have got somewhere between 80 and 100 today. That's going to cause me anxiety, because I'm not going to have time to answer those. Then I'm going to fret about it, because I have a sense of responsibility, and I think, I ought to do that. This phone hasn't made me happy. I don't think it's this particular phone. I don't think it's ever made me happy at all. In fact, I'll go so far as to, I dislike this phone a hell of a lot. In fact, when I look around my house, I find I dislike quite a lot of the stuff that I've got, a lot, because it actually doesn't do much for me. At the point when I got it, I sort of thought, I need that, or it's a measuring point, or it's better than that one. I'll get a new one. But when I actually look at it, it's not doing much for me. And this was really brought home when I was making that programme for the BBC about population growth, and we brought in the issue of consumption. And I felt that it was only fair that I exposed my own inadequacies and how I too am part of that problem. And I sit in my kitchen on the programme and tell you, and I'm just horrifically ashamed, that I've got 8 vacuuming devices. I'll just try and explain it. I've got an obsessive personality. I'm a bit OCD in some ways, and therefore I like cleaning, and my house is relatively sort of immaculately clean, given that I live with dogs, a stepdaughter, and sometimes a partner who aren't quite as obsessed with the hoovering as I am. And I've got separate ones because one does one sort of job and one does another one, to the extent that one's quite good at sucking up hair and the other one can suck up water and leaves, and there's no excuse, is there? I mean, I'm scrabbling around, but no one 58-year-old bloke needs 8 hoovers at all. And yet, you will find parallels in your life. I'm exposing my own, corrupt hoover fetish. But I'm sure if you were to go home, you might find that you've got any number of one too many of those that you don't need. At least I've only got 2 TVs in the world. I know people who've got one in virtually every room. But I mean, whatever takes your fancy. I'd rather be hoovering than watching TV. I get more satisfaction out of that than I get out of the other. That's the truth of it. But we're all there, aren't we? And maybe we see this as a means of, measuring our wealth, if you like, what we can afford to buy, what we think sets our standard of living, our quality of life. But ultimately, what I've come to realise is that this doesn't make me happy at all. In fact, it's the reverse. And the things that make me happiest are those things which are far more fundamental. In fact, the thing that makes me more happy, more consistently, more predictably, although happiness is always transient, but the thing that ticks that box is when I get up in the morning and I walk out into the woods and I wander around on my own, no other human beings, for an hour with my poodles. It's very personal. Obviously, I'm into wildlife. I engage with that environment. I like walking. I can take things in at that pace. I like the smell of the place. I like the structure of the place, the sound. I like sharing it with my dogs. I like seeing them happy. That makes me happy. I called my previous dogs my joy grenades. Every time I let them off the lead, they exploded and made me happy. And I think there's a change in mindset that we're going to have to go through if we're going to address our apparent need for consumption, because you don't need 8 hoovers and you don't need to upgrade this nonsense every 18 months. So that means that we're going to have to combat something quite significant, which is our current obsession with progress being an increase in economic growth, GMP. It's what we hear about, isn't it? That's what we're going to be hearing a hell of a lot about in the next X weeks before that election. And they're going to be talking about growth, economic stability, jobs, consumption. And there's no ambiguity about the fact that, until we get ecologists and economists in the same room finding some sort of balance, then the idea of economic growth points only one way, and that is to environmental catastrophe. And yet we're the fuel for that growth. We're the Hoover buying, phone updating users. So I think that one of the things that we're going to have to do is change our mindset. And I think that, again, preparation is always a good thing. Prevention is always better than cure. So maybe one of the things that we should be doing is saying to younger people, there are other means of finding satisfaction. There are other means of achieving success or perceiving success. There are other values which you should see and understand, rather than just chasing the dollar, chasing the pound or the yen. And just to conclude, those young people, well, of all of the reasons to be optimistic that I've found in the last recent months, none has been more generating optimism than the youth climate strikes and Fridays for Future campaign, run all over the world by young people who, through their own motivation, have got out and skipped their education, a valuable part of their life, and gone out onto the streets wherever they are and stood there saying, we want a voice, we want a future. You've denied us a healthy one. You haven't done what you needed to do. So now we are demanding it. And that's what that young woman said, that child said. I demand a healthy future. And why shouldn't she? And the fact that this has been self-motivated, the fact that we haven't needed to set their alarms, the fact that they continue to do that themselves, speaks an enormous volume of difference between, our generation and the interim generations up until now. And I just think it's probably the greatest symbol of optimism that we've got. It's not just us in Extinction Rebellion, it's all of those young people who are becoming aware of the fact that their future is imperiled and they need to do something about it. And they're doing something fundamentally important. They are raising their voices. They're raising their voices to be heard. And I recognised a long time ago, in the mid-70s, in the teens, when I was listening to some of the punk rock mantras. Punk rock wasn't all about, spitting and shouting and safety pins. It was actually about a do-it-yourself culture. It was about, being dissatisfied in mid-70s Britain with all of the horrors that were going on then, and recognising that if you wanted to make a difference, you had to get up and do it yourself. That's what it came down to. No one was going to fix it for you. You had to fix it. And you had to demand other fixes were made. And my favourite punk rock record is a song by a band called Penetration. Now, I wouldn't ask you to go home and listen to it. It won't appeal to very many of you, I'm sure. But what you could do is just Google the lyrics and read those, because they are a paean to self-empowerment. They are demonstratively saying, do not be told what to do. Challenge authority. And more than anything, shout above the noise. Raise your voice. Have a voice. Exercise that voice for change. And when collectively the youth of the world are shouting above the noise, then what I hear is that distant hope. Now you're going to say, is it going to make any difference that they're skipping school, that they're standing there with their signs? Well, how many people are there here? Don't know. Let's imagine that there are about 300 people here, I imagine. I don't know. Maybe I'm exaggerating. I'm a naturalist. We're prone to exaggerate. That python, 50 foot long. Can I ask you to stand up? Would you mind standing up from the red? Can you stand up for just a moment? And then if you would stand up too, and yourself, and then maybe you down to here. So all of those people there, could you just stand up for one moment so I can make a brief point? I'd like you to imagine that our audience tonight is the population of the UK as it stands at the moment. And what we know, again, from science, is that in order to enact any change within our society, we need just 3% of people to ask for that change in a forceful, demonstrative way. Now, 3% of the people, if there are 300 here tonight, are these people who are currently standing up. Is that too much to ask? Do we honestly think that we can't get to a point when we can't convince 3% of the UK population that if they don't take some action, the world will catastrophically fail, that their children will starve or die of thirst or be killed in conflict over food and water? Is that too much to ask? I don't think so, and nor do Extinction Rebellion. And I have every confidence that we'll get our 3% of people, because I think enough people will stand up and ask for change, and that they will find the capacity to change themselves to make that difference. So on that account, stand up if you're prepared to accept that and help. There you go. It wasn't hard, was it? Thank you very much for coming along this evening. I really appreciate your attention.